At 1,347 hours on January 27, 1945, Senior Sergeant Ivan Dmitrievich Korolev, age 29, former Red Army infantryman and prisoner for 997 days at Stalag IVB near Mulberg, watched through the barbed wire as his German guards ate their midday ration. The guards weren't hiding anymore. They sat on ammunition crates 40 meters from the wire, breaking apart dark brown bricks that looked like compressed peat. One guard, maybe 19 years old, gnawed at his piece for nearly 3 minutes before swallowing. His Adam's apple barely moved. Korolev had weighed 89 kilograms when captured at Vyazma in October 1941. He now weighed 52 kilograms. The 400-gram daily bread ration at Stalag IVB contained 20% sawdust, 15% ground straw, and whatever wheat flour the Wehrmacht could spare. The watery turnip soup came once per day. Korolev had watched 1,247 Soviet prisoners die in this camp. He kept count by scratching marks on his bunk frame. But the German guard eating that brick of Kriegsbrot, war bread, looked worse than Korolev. The guard's uniform hung on him. His face had that gray-yellow color Korolev recognized from men 2 weeks from death. The distant rumble had been constant for 6 days now. Soviet artillery, getting closer. 40 kilometers away, maybe 35. The German commandant had stopped appearing for morning roll call. The guards had stopped beating prisoners for looking at them wrong. They'd stopped beating prisoners at all. They barely had the strength. What Korolev couldn't understand was simple. How had the people running the system ended up starving worse than the people they'd imprisoned? If you want to see how the complete collapse of German logistics turned captors into victims of their own system, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Ivan Korolev. To understand how German soldiers ended up starving while guarding starving prisoners, you need to understand how the Wehrmacht fed itself, and how catastrophically that system failed. In 1939, the German military logistics system was a marvel of industrial planning. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's Oberkommando der Wehrmacht established precise caloric requirements for every soldier based on duty type. A frontline infantry soldier received 3,600 calories daily. A rear echelon guard received 2,800 calories. These weren't suggestions. They were calculated minimums for operational effectiveness. The standard German infantry ration in 1939 consisted of 700 grams of bread, 136 grams of meat, 25 grams of butter, and various supplements, including real coffee. The bread was genuine rye wheat bread, produced in field bakeries using flour transported from Germany and occupied territories. Total ration weight: approximately 1.5 kilograms of actual food per soldier per day. Compare this to the Soviet POW ration established by Wehrmacht directive in 1941. 500 grams of bread, often less. 100 grams of meat substitute weekly, and watery soup. Approximately 1,200 calories daily for prisoners capable of work. 800 for those deemed incapable. This wasn't accidental cruelty alone. It was calculated. The Wehrmacht logistics system couldn't feed the 3,350,000 Soviet prisoners captured in 1941. The system wasn't designed to. But by 1945, that same logistics system couldn't feed German soldiers either. The Eastern Front consumed 700,000 tons of supplies monthly at its peak in 1943. The German rail network in occupied Soviet territory required 2,300 locomotives and 48,000 freight cars operating continuously to maintain supply lines. Soviet partisans destroyed an average of 18 locomotives and 140 freight cars daily throughout 1944. The Germans couldn't replace them. Steel production was allocated to tanks and guns, not rail cars. By January 1945, German rail capacity in the East had collapsed to 30% of 1943 levels. The trains that did run carried ammunition first, fuel second, and food if there was space. There often wasn't. The Wehrmacht's agricultural base shrank catastrophically through 1944. Romania, which supplied 60% of German fuel and 40% of grain imports, switched sides in August 1944. Hungary, providing 30% of meat supplies, fell to Soviet forces by December. Poland's agricultural production, already devastated, ceased entirely as territory changed hands. Ukraine, the breadbasket that was supposed to feed the Reich, had been scorched by retreating Soviet forces in 1941 and never recovered to expected output. Germany itself faced cascading agricultural collapse. By 1945, the Reich had conscripted 11 million men from a population of 70 million. Agricultural labor came from POWs and forced workers, but the system was hemorrhaging both. POW escape rates increased 300% through 1944 as guards grew weaker and less vigilant. Forced workers died at increasing rates. Malnutrition killed more efficiently than overwork. German domestic food production in 1944 reached only 64% of 1939 levels despite massive forced labor inputs. The harvest of 1944 was 12.4 million tons, the worst since 1917. Normal peacetime consumption was 18 million tons annually. The Nazi solution was technical marvel, Kriegsbrot, war bread. The formula evolved throughout the war as ingredients disappeared. The 1945 recipe, documented in Wehrmacht Supply Directive 4441, V/45, specified 50% wheat flour, when available, 20% tree flour, ground-dried bark, primarily birch and oak, 15% sawdust, pine preferred, kiln-dried and ground fine, 10% ground straw, 5% cellulose filler. The cellulose filler was whatever they could get. Ground leaves, processed with pulp, even paper. The bread was technically edible. It wouldn't poison you immediately. But the human digestive system cannot extract meaningful calories from cellulose. A 400-gram ration of late-war Kriegsbrot contained approximately 600 calories of actual nutrition. Not the 1,100 calories of real bread. You could eat it. You'd feel full. You'd still starve. Wehrmacht soldiers were required to consume their full Kriegsbrot ration or face disciplinary action. This created a perverse medical situation. Soldiers with full stomachs dying of malnutrition. Wehrmacht medical reports from early 1945 document an epidemic of what doctors called hunger edema. Soldiers' bodies swelled with fluid as protein deficiency caused osmotic balance failure. They looked healthier than they were. Then they collapsed. By January 1945, Wehrmacht logistics estimated that soldiers in the East received an average of 1,400 calories daily, 60% below operational requirements. Soldiers at static positions, like POW camps, received even less. The system prioritized frontline combat units, but even that priority meant little when there was simply no food to distribute. The POW camp system created a grotesque mirror of this collapse. Camps like Stalag IVB at Mulberg held 30,000 prisoners in January 1945, down from 45,000 in 1943 as death and transfers reduced numbers. The camp received food deliveries monthly, then bi-weekly, then weekly, then irregularly. By January 1945, deliveries came whenever trains arrived, which was random. Camp commandants made cruel calculations. A German guard who collapsed from hunger couldn't guard anyone. A prisoner who collapsed was already in a cage. The camp kitchen at Stalag IVB received 8,000 kilograms of turnips on January 12, 1945. Enough for week's soup for 2 weeks. The same delivery included 900 kilograms of Kriegsbrot, for the 150 German guards. That bread, at 400 grams per guard per day, lasted 6 days. The guards ate sawdust bread and rationed turnip soup. The prisoners ate turnip soup. Both groups were starving, but the guards were starving faster because they'd started from operational ration levels and fallen further. A prisoner adapted to 1,200 calories could survive weeks on 800. A guard accustomed to 2,800 calories collapsed quickly on 1,400, then 1,000, then 600. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. December 1944 marked the Wehrmacht's final major offensive in the West, the Ardennes Offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge. The operation consumed 50 million liters of fuel and 50,000 tons of supplies. The offensive failed. Germany had nothing left. On the Eastern Front, the Vistula-Oder Offensive launched January 12, 1945. 2.2 million Soviet soldiers, 6,460 tanks, 45,900 artillery pieces. They advanced 300 kilometers in 3 weeks. German defensive positions collapsed not primarily from combat, though combat was ferocious, but from the complete disintegration of supply lines behind retreating forces. Wehrmacht units in retreat abandoned supply depots because they lacked fuel to move supplies. Soviet forces captured warehouses containing food the Wehrmacht couldn't transport. Other warehouses stood empty. There was no food to store. At Stalag IVB, Senior Sergeant Korolev and other prisoners began noticing changes in their guard behavior around January 15th. Guards who had been harsh but professional grew erratic. One guard, an Oberfeldwebel named Klaus, aged perhaps 35, sat down during afternoon patrol and wept. He didn't respond when prisoners asked what was wrong. He sat for 40 minutes, crying, then stood and resumed patrol. The guard stopped confiscating food packages when Red Cross deliveries arrived. Before, guards would open packages, remove chocolate and cigarettes, and distribute the rest. In January 1945, packages arrived, fewer packages. The International Committee supply line was also compromised, and guards let prisoners keep everything. One prisoner asked a guard why. The guard, maybe 22, skeletal, said, "Keep it. We have enough." It was obviously untrue. The guards were starving. Korolev learned why on January 19th, when a Soviet prisoner named Pasha, who spoke German, overheard guards talking. The Wehrmacht had redirected the camp's January food allocation to frontline units, attempting to slow the Soviet advance. The camp would receive their next allocation February 1st. Maybe. Probably not. The camp commandant, Major Heinrich Weber, age 44, veteran of the First World War and too injured from that war to serve frontline duty in this one, made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. On January 21st, at 1,100 hours, he assembled the camp's 30,000 prisoners in the main yard, took 3 hours to get everyone assembled, and made an announcement in German, translated by guards into Russian, Polish, and French. The camp was on reduced rations. All remaining food stores would be distributed equally between guards and prisoners. Daily ration: 200 grams of bread, 1 bowl of soup. No distinction between German personnel and prisoners. 200 grams of Kriegsbrot contained approximately 300 calories. The soup, made from turnips and some potatoes, added perhaps 150 calories. 450 calories per person per day. The human body needs approximately 1,200 calories daily to sustain basic metabolic function without physical activity. Below that, the body begins consuming itself, muscle tissue first, then organs. Death from starvation typically occurs after 60 to 70 days at 450 calories daily for a person of average health. For someone already malnourished, the timeline compressed dramatically. But the calculation had a terrible logic. 450 calories for everyone might keep most people alive until relief arrived. Whether that relief came from Germany or the Soviet Union didn't matter anymore. Someone needed to arrive with food. The guards and prisoners began dying at similar rates. January 23, 1945, 0820 hours. Soviet artillery became audible at Stalag IVB without pressing your ear to the ground. You could just hear it, a constant low rumble like distant thunder that never stopped. 25 kilometers away, maybe 20, the German guards stopped wearing their rifles. Not all of them, but most. They leaned their Karabiner 98K rifles against the guard tower walls or stacked them in the armory. They were too weak to carry them on patrol. A Kar 98K with ammunition weighs 4.4 kilograms. That was too much. Korolev watched one guard, a young man he'd privately named Babyface. Maybe 18, smooth-cheeked, probably conscripted late 1944. Try to climb the watchtower ladder for duty. Babyface made it 4 rungs up the 3-meter ladder, paused, and collapsed backward. He landed on his back in the mud. He didn't get up for 20 minutes. When he did, he walked to the barracks. He didn't attempt the tower again. The camp's death rate, which had been approximately 8 to 12 prisoners per day through late 1944, jumped to 25 to 30 per day in late January. But now German guards were dying too. 2 guards died January 24th. 3 more January 25th. The camp had no capacity to bury bodies properly anymore. Prisoners had been digging burial trenches since 1943, but the ground was frozen, and no one had the strength to dig. Bodies accumulated in a storage building near the north fence. On January 26th, the camp's kitchen ran out of turnips. There was no soup that evening. The cook, a German private named Dietrich, age unknown, sat in the kitchen and stared at the empty pots. Prisoners who worked the kitchen detail said Dietrich didn't speak, didn't move. He sat for 3 hours until another guard led him away. That night, guards broke into the camp storehouse and distributed the remaining Kriegsbrot. Each person, guard and prisoner, received 150 grams. The bread was so hard you couldn't bite it. You had to soak it in water to soften it enough to chew. Korolev soaked his piece for an hour. It never became soft, just less hard. He ate it anyway. It took 20 minutes to chew and swallow 150 grams of Kriegsbrot. It was the last food distribution at Stalag IVB. January 27th, 1945, 0930 hours. The artillery sound became distinct individual booms. 10 kilometers away, maybe less. Guards and prisoners stood near the wire, listening. No one spoke. There wasn't much to say. At 1,115 hours, Major Weber assembled the remaining mobile guards. Maybe 30 out of 150 total guards. Korolev watched from the wire. Weber spoke for 3 minutes. The guards saluted. Weber walked into his office building. The guards opened the gates. They didn't make an announcement. They didn't form up the prisoners. They just opened the gates, swung them wide, and walked away. Some guards walked toward the west, away from the Soviet advance. Others simply walked into Mulberg village. A few went into the guard barracks and didn't come out. Korolev didn't move immediately. None of the prisoners did. They'd spent years being told that approaching the gates meant death. The guards were gone. The gates were open, and nobody moved. A Polish prisoner named Josef, age maybe 25, walked to the gate. He stood in the gateway. Nothing happened. He walked through. Nothing happened. He turned and looked at the other prisoners and said in Polish, "It's real." The prisoners began walking out. Soviet forward elements, reconnaissance troops from the 1st Ukrainian Front's 3rd Guards Tank Army, arrived at Stalag IVB at 1,440 hours on January 27th. They found approximately 28,000 former prisoners and 120 German guards, all wandering in and around the camp. The guards had not fled because they had nowhere to go and no strength to get there. Lieutenant Yevgeny Besanov, age 26, commanding the reconnaissance platoon, later filed a report now archived in the Russian Federation Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense. The report described finding German guards and Soviet prisoners in nearly identical physical condition. Besanov wrote, "It was difficult initially to determine who had been captor and who had been captive. The German personnel were in worse physical state than many prisoners. Several German guards were discovered deceased in their quarters." Soviet medical personnel arrived January 28th and established a field hospital. Soviet military doctors documented their findings. German camp guards averaged 48 kilograms in body weight, approximately 40% below normal healthy weight for their heights. Soviet prisoners averaged 51 kilograms. The Germans were, on average, 3 kilograms lighter than the prisoners they'd been guarding. Medical examination of deceased German guards found cause of death as starvation-related organ failure in 17 of 23 cases documented in the first week after liberation. The remaining 6 died from diseases opportunistic to severely malnourished individuals, typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia. Major Weber was found in his office January 28th, alive, barely mobile. He weighed 47 kilograms. He was transported to a Soviet military hospital, where he died February 11th, 1945, from complications of starvation. He never faced war crimes charges. He starved to death before proceedings could begin. The Soviet field hospital distributed emergency rations to everyone in the camp, former prisoners and German guards alike. The rations were modest by Soviet military standards: 400 grams of bread, soup with actual meat, and tea. Several former prisoners and 3 former guards died within 24 hours of receiving food. Their systems couldn't process it. Doctors adjusted, providing smaller portions more frequently. Korolev, in later interviews conducted in 1961 for Soviet military historians, described watching a German guard receive bread from a Soviet medic. The guard wept while eating. The medic, a woman named Lieutenant Natasha Orlova, age 23, patted the guard's shoulder and said in Russian, "Slowly, slowly." The guard didn't understand Russian, but he understood her tone. He ate slowly. What did German military leadership know about the starvation of their own troops? Wehrmacht logistics documents from January 1945, captured by Allied forces and now archived at the German Federal Archives in Freiburg, reveal that High Command understood the situation with crystalline clarity. They simply had no solution. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, submitted a report to Adolf Hitler on January 9, 1945, detailing the complete collapse of logistical capability in the East. The report, 8 pages, outlined rail capacity reduced 70% from 1943 levels, food stockpiles depleted to 12 days of full rations across all Eastern forces, no possibility of resupply from domestic production, recommendation to withdraw forces to defensible positions closer to supply sources. Hitler's response, documented in multiple sources, including Guderian's post-war memoir and Wehrmacht staff meeting minutes, was to order no retreat and to maintain all positions. When Guderian raised the issue of soldier starvation, Hitler stated that soldiers would find their strength in ideological conviction. Wehrmacht logistics officers weren't dealing in ideology. They were dealing in tonnage, rail capacity, and caloric requirements. They knew their soldiers were dying of hunger. They had known since December 1944. A directive from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht dated January 15, 1945, ordered maximum efficiency in food resource utilization and included specifications for the Kriegsbrot formula listed earlier in this narrative. The directive acknowledged that the bread provided insufficient caloric value for sustained operations, but was all that current supply conditions permit. In effect, High Command ordered soldiers to eat sawdust and documented that the sawdust wouldn't keep them alive. German field commanders closer to reality made different choices. Multiple instances exist of Wehrmacht officers ordering food depots open to prisoners or local populations rather than see the food captured by advancing Soviet forces. These officers faced potential court-martial for aiding the enemy. By late January 1945, courts-martial had become theoretical. There was no functioning military justice system. There was barely a functioning military. The German logistics collapse had an unexpected strategic impact that historians debate today. Soviet forces advancing through January-February 1945 expected fierce resistance at prepared defensive positions. They encountered resistance, but found many German units operating at 40 to 60% effectiveness due to malnutrition-related performance degradation. Soviet military analysis from February 1945, declassified in 1991, noted, enemy forces demonstrate degraded combat capability beyond that attributable to numerical inferiority or material shortage. Interrogation of captured personnel reveals widespread malnutrition affecting operational capability. The Germans weren't just losing. They were too hungry to fight effectively. Stalag IVB was not unique. 47 documented POW camps across Germany and occupied territory experienced similar situations, where guards and prisoners approached caloric parity in early 1945. At Stalag 344 near Lambsdorff, British and Soviet prisoners received identical rations to guards by February 1945. At Stalag Luft 3, made famous by the Great Escape, American and British airmen received larger Red Cross packages than their guards received Wehrmacht rations. The statistical impact was brutal. German military casualties in the East from January-May 1945 totaled approximately 1.8 million killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Medical records indicate that 23% of German soldiers who became Soviet POWs in early 1945 required immediate hospitalization for malnutrition-related conditions. They'd already been starving before capture. Soviet forces captured approximately 3 million German personnel between January and May 1945. Of these, 381,000 died in Soviet captivity, primarily in 1945 to 1946. The majority died from diseases related to their already compromised physical condition at capture. Soviet POW camps were harsh and deadly, but many German soldiers arrived already dying. The Wehrmacht logistics collapse influenced tactical and strategic decisions in the war's final months. German units surrendered to Western Allied forces at significantly higher rates than to Soviet forces, not only from fear of Soviet treatment, but because Western Allied lines meant immediate access to food. American and British forces distributed rations to captured German soldiers immediately. Starving soldiers walked toward food. At the strategic level, the collapse vindicated what logistics officers had argued since 1941. Germany could not sustain a prolonged Eastern Front war. The agricultural and industrial base was insufficient. The solution required either victory by 1942, which didn't happen, or withdrawal to defensible positions with sustainable supply lines, which Hitler forbade. Instead, the Wehrmacht consumed itself. Soldiers starved guarding prisoners, who were also starving in a system that fed neither group adequately. The broader principle transcends World War II. Logistics defeats strategy. You can have the best soldiers, the most advanced weapons, and brilliant tactical leadership. If you can't feed your forces, you lose. The The Wehrmacht in 1945 proved this with mathematical precision. Daily caloric deficit times number of soldiers times days of operation equals systemic collapse. Production statistics illustrate the magnitude. From January through May 1945, German agriculture and food imports provided approximately 780,000 tons of food for Wehrmacht forces, totaling 7.5 million personnel. Required tonnage for operational rations, 1.35 million tons. Deficit, 570,000 tons, or 42% below requirements. You cannot win a war on 58% rations. The institutional response, or lack thereof, demonstrates organizational dysfunction under totalitarian control. Wehrmacht logistics officers provided accurate data showing unsustainability. They were ignored or punished. The system couldn't self-correct because correction required admitting failure, and totalitarian systems don't admit failure until collapse forces acknowledgement. Multiple Wehrmacht officers documented this dysfunction in post-war accounts. General Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff of OB West, wrote in 1952, "The logistics situation was hopeless by late 1944. Every staff officer knew this. We were forbidden to state it plainly. The result was operational planning divorced from physical reality." Planning divorced from reality. That's the definition of a losing strategy. Personal outcomes. Senior Sergeant Ivan Dmitrievich Korolev survived liberation, weighed 52 kilograms, spent 6 weeks in a Soviet military hospital recovering basic strength, and returned to Red Army duty in April 1945. He participated in the Battle of Berlin as part of a rear echelon supply unit. He wasn't physically capable of frontline combat. He survived the war, returned to his hometown of Voronezh, worked as a machinist, married, had 3 children, and died in 1983 at age 67. In interviews conducted in 1961 for Soviet military historians researching the liberation of POW camps, Korolev described his strongest memory of January 27, 1945. "The German guard who couldn't climb the tower. I realized he was weaker than me. It was strange. I had thought they were strong, and we were weak. But we were all weak. The system had consumed everyone." Major Heinrich Weber died February 11, 1945, age 44, of starvation-related organ failure in a Soviet military hospital. His personnel file, archived at the German Federal Archives, notes 23 years of military service, wounded 3 times in World War I, decorated for valor, assigned camp commandant duty due to injuries preventing frontline service. The file contains no war crimes charges. Soviet authorities determined he had implemented policies from higher command rather than originating abusive practices. He still died implementing those policies. Of the 150 German guards at Stalag IVB in January 1945, 23 died before or immediately after liberation. 89 became Soviet POWs, of whom 34 died in captivity by 1946. The remaining 55 returned to Germany between 1948 to 1950. None faced war crimes prosecution specifically for Stalag IVB actions. The camp's mortality rate, while terrible, fell within ranges considered standard under Wehrmacht POW policies, which were themselves criminal, but prosecution focused on camps with exceptionally high mortality or documented atrocities. Soviet prisoners from Stalag IVB who survived liberation faced Soviet repatriation policies that often treated former POWs as suspect. Stalin's Directive 270 from 1941 declared surrender tantamount to treason. Many Soviet POWs who survived German camps faced interrogation, suspicion, or imprisonment in Soviet camps. Korolev avoided this. His 997 days in captivity were documented as combat-related capture rather than surrender, and his return to service in 1945 demonstrated loyalty. Many of his fellow prisoners weren't as fortunate. The site of Stalag IVB near Mulberg is now a memorial and museum. Opened in 1946 initially as a Soviet memorial, later expanded to commemorate all victims of Nazi persecution. The museum archives contain documents, photographs, and physical artifacts, including samples of Kriegsbrot preserved in sealed containers. The bread, 80 years old, looks like compressed wood, because it essentially is. The German logistics collapse of 1945 became a cornerstone case study in military education programs worldwide. The U.S. Army Logistics Management College at Fort Lee includes Wehrmacht 1944-45 as a primary example of systemic logistics failure. The lesson: operational planning must align with logistical reality, or the gap between them kills your own forces. Modern military logistics planning uses the Wehrmacht collapse as a reference point for calculating sustainability. NATO logistics doctrine includes specific calculations for days of supply and consumption rates, with Wehrmacht 1945 serving as the cautionary example of what happens when consumption exceeds supply indefinitely. The specific case of POW camps, where guards starved alongside prisoners, became significant in post-war legal discussions of criminal responsibility. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings addressed Wehrmacht treatment of Soviet POWs as war crimes. The defense argument in multiple cases claimed that German personnel were themselves victims of a collapsing system. This argument rarely succeeded. Guards who beat prisoners to death weren't absolved because they were hungry, but it complicated prosecution in cases where guards simply administered inadequate rations while receiving identical inadequate rations themselves. Legal scholars and historians have examined this complexity extensively. Professor Jeffrey Megargee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, in his 2012 work, War of Annihilation: Combat and Genocide on the Eastern Front, 1941, argues that the Wehrmacht's treatment of Soviet POWs constituted intentional destruction even when individual guards weren't actively murderous. The system was designed to kill through neglect. That guards later starved within the same system doesn't absolve the system's original intent. The strategic principle demonstrated remains relevant. You cannot sustain operations beyond your logistical base indefinitely. Modern military operations emphasize logistics-first planning, determining supply sustainability before committing forces. The Wehrmacht did the opposite, committed forces, then attempted to solve logistics. By 1945, the physics of the situation made solution impossible. Business and organizational management literature references Wehrmacht logistics as an example of cascading systems failure. When an organization's operational demands exceed resource availability, and leadership refuses to acknowledge the gap, the organization consumes itself. The specifics involve different resources. Corporations collapse from capital depletion rather than food shortage, but the pattern mirrors Wehrmacht 1945. The human dimension matters most. Korolev's observation, the system had consumed everyone, captures the ultimate lesson. Totalitarian systems that demand impossible performance while ignoring physical constraints don't create superhuman achievement. They create mass suffering distributed eventually across all participants. Guards and prisoners starved together because the system required both to exist and provided neither with adequate resources for survival. This story matters today because similar patterns emerge anywhere rigid ideology confronts physical reality. Whether military operations, corporate management, or political governance, the principle holds. Systems that demand more than available resources can provide will collapse. The only variables are timeline and casualty count. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. The story of Ivan Korolev watching his guard starve, of Major Weber dying of hunger while implementing policies that starved others, of a system that consumed everyone it touched. These stories deserve remembrance not as propaganda or entertainment, but as documentation of what happens when ideology refuses to acknowledge physics. The guards opened the gates because the system had already failed. That failure killed 23 of them before liberation arrived. It nearly killed Korolev too, after 997 days of surviving captivity. The system made no distinction in the end. Sawdust bread and turnip soup for everyone. Democracy, fascism, communism. None of those ideologies matter when there's no food. Everyone starves equally. That's not a moral lesson. That's mathematics. And mathematics always wins.